Hi everyone, my name is Kristen. I'm here to host you tonight as we celebrate the amazing author Liz Michalski, who's going to be joined in conversation by RJ Julia's COO and President Lori. Also so a little bit about Liz before we get started. I don't really, I'm not going to go into your personal history because I feel like everyone here knows that. So
Especially the ones in the back.
I had a PowerPoint presentation with pictures from high school. We'll skip past that.
Thank you.
As you guys know, this is your second novel. The first one was Even Fall, which was a fantastic, read taking place in rural Connecticut. You guys may be familiar. Fantastic supernatural story, love, redemption, regret, ghosts. Really, really fantastic.
Makes it sound so good.
I recommend it. And then of course, Darling Girl, the newest installment, and I'm 50 pages in. I'm obsessed. It's fantastic. The story of kind of picking up Peter Pan a few generations later, where we're meeting up with the descendant of Wendy Darling, who's incorporated into the modern world, fairly effectively. She's got a job that she enjoys. She's got a family that she loves, complicated as they are. But she also has a secret, and that is that Peter Pan did once visit her, and he was not all that he seemed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to these enchanting ladies and give them a warm welcome.
That was I think, a nice way of putting Peter Pan, but and I don't think we'll talk too much about the book because nobody's read it, so we might touch on some things, but we don't want to spoil anything. We got to let them sink their teeth into it. So what I'd like to do is find out about your process, hear a little bit about how you came to writing the book and developing the story and the characters. So I jotted some notes, but I want to start let's kind of start way back. When did you decide you wanted to be a writer? Were you the kid who walked around with a book everywhere you went? Were you the kid that in class was couldn't wait for the the creative writing section of the class? Or tell us a little bit about.
Yes, I was the kid who her favorite thing to do on vacation, the highlight was going to the library and coming home with a stack of books. And I was also the kid who I was a late reader. I remember in kindergarten being panicked because I could tell that my peers were reading flashcards and I had no idea what was going on. And in first grade it was the same way. We didn't really have remedial classes back then. And my parents would work with me and I just hated it. And someone, I remember very clearly, gave me the Chronicles of Narnia and said, you might like this. And it was the first book that I ever read that I just was obsessed with. And I remember very clearly being in second grade with Mrs. Paul in math class with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader open under my desk. And I remember her coming over and very gently just closing the desk, which explains why my math skills are so wonderful today. Apparently I missed that entire year. But yeah, I never put together the idea of reading and being a writer.
Okay.
I liked writing and it was something that I was decent at because I read so much. But it was never something that I thought that I could do in terms of being an author. I always knew I wanted to write and maybe be a reporter or something like that, but that was just not something I ever put together.
So when did it switch? What happened to say, okay, well, I'm going to give it a whirl and I'm going to write a novel?
I think that I had kids, and right before I had kids, I was freelancing and I was looking for something to supplement my income. So I picked up a lot more freelancing, and then when my kids were born, I couldn't do the interviews that I had been doing during my freelancing because my son gave up naps at 4 months. Those of you who know him remember those days. And so I couldn't make my deadlines, and I didn't want to hire a babysitter for that. So I thought I would try writing because nobody was waiting for a deadline for a book for me. So I could just kind of knock out a sentence here and there and go from there. So you can thank my kids.
Yeah, I think I will. So this is your second novel, as we mentioned. Was the process the same? Did you write? And I guess maybe we start with the process. Do you develop your characters? Do you have in mind a character? Do you have the plot in mind? How did you do that? And was it the same for both books?
I think it's the same for both books in the getting from the beginning to the end is the hard part. So, and that is usually just a lot. The plot almost never changes, but the way I get there changes a lot, and that's a lot of rewriting.
Yeah. How long did it take to write Darling Girl?
It took me a really long time. So I had a book that I wrote after Even Fall that didn't sell, and my agent, who was very, very good, and I decided to kind of amicably part ways. And I thought there's a statistic that something like 95% of people who publish one novel never publish another one. And I was like, I'm not going to be that 95%, damn it. So I wrote a draft of this, and I sent it out. I wrote multiple drafts, and I sent it out to agents. And I got some really lovely requests for fulls, and then I got some really lovely rejections.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked with a friend who was an editor, and rewrote it again, and then rewrote it again, and then rewrote it again, and then I sent it back out to a handful of agents who had been really welcoming to me, and said, I just rewrote this again, would you be interested in looking at it? And a couple of them said yes, and the agent that I had first connected with on the very first round of drafts was very interested in it, and she was my dream agent, so it worked out very well.
Great. And it's with Dutton, right? Yeah. And had you, I'm trying to remember, what was Even Fall? Was that?
It was Berkeley.
Okay.
So
All right.
same
So
house.
yeah, same house, but different immigrants.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, great. And so I guess your characters, when you go to develop the characters now, so retellings are really, really popular right now. So, Darling Girl is a retelling of Peter Pan, and retellings is a really hot genre right now. So, particularly in YA, young adults, and you have sort of your, some characters that you can base this. But how did you decide what you wanted to do with the rest of them? Like, did you know you wanted it to be the granddaughter of Wendy, or did you? I know you said you rewrote it. So tell us a little bit about, were characters just left on the the cutting room?
So I started writing this book because I've always been like a crazy vivid dreamer, which sounds ridiculous. It sounds like a really bad story, but it's true. And I dreamed one night that there was a turret in England. It was a stone turret, and there were windows without glass, and there was no door. And there was a woman in the bottom of the turret who was dressed in Wendy blue, who was hooked up to all these different machines. And there were boys in Peter Pan green flying in through the window, saying, "Who's going to save us now? Like, who's going to sacrifice themselves for us when she's gone?" And I woke up and I thought that was very disturbing. And so I reread Peter Pan, which is also very disturbing. The original Peter Pan, a lot of people haven't read, and it's a really dark book. And I got kind of obsessed with Peter Pan, but also Jay and Barrie, who had a very, very, very dark life. And from there, I knew that I wanted to. He had a lot of issues. I don't want to say issues, but he had a lot of very strong women in his life. And it's really clear in Peter Pan that he really has an affection for Mrs. Darling, because he talks about her in this way where he says something along the lines of, she was like her mind was like a connection of the boxes that you get from the Orient, where you open one and there's always another one inside, but no one can ever open the last one. And I thought, well, clearly she is a very interesting character, and she has a well-developed inner life, so why do we never hear anything about her? Why is she always just waiting by the window for the kids to come home? So I started looking at it from that point of view. What were the women in Peter Pan doing while the kids were out on adventures, and how did the adventures impact them as opposed to impacting the kids? So that's how I started. And from that it was easy because you have such strong characters in the original that you don't really see that much about. So, especially the women. So focusing on the women is kind of natural from that point.
So I just plowed through this because it's really great, and you just, I'm like, well, one more chapter, and I haven't had a book like that in a while. There's a lot of books that I read and I like, but not so much that you just want to know the story. But I will say that there were times when I did put it down that I went and started researching Barrie, because I was like, and you almost, the way that you have written this, you almost feel like the Darlings are real people. Like, I'm like, were they real people? I know they were based on another family, but I'm thinking to myself, I've got to research this, because that's how relatable it is. I mean, it was fascinating, and I'm like, all right, I'm like this. It's way too late for me to be researching Peter Pan stories, but I did. I was just fascinated and you could go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, and I definitely did. I mean, so Peter Pan was actually first in a book called The Little White Bird,
Right.
which came out around, I think, 1903, 1904. And from the lens of today, and it's hard to talk about literature that was written back in the early 1900s from our point of view today, because there's a lot of things that we might not agree with or find concerning or upsetting that was normal for that time period. But he wrote this book called Little White Bird, and it's basically about this man who kind of becomes obsessed with a young boy and does everything he can do to kind of separate the boy from his mother and take over the boy's affections. And that part of it, so the Peter Pan part of it is he's telling the boy the stories about a little fairy who lives in Kensington Gardens. And then from there it became his own little book, and then it became a play. And he wrote a lot about children, and he had a very disturbing childhood. I don't know if you know kind of the details of it.
I dabbled in that.
So his mother was one of, I think she had a big family. I think she was one of like 8 children. And when she was young, when she was 7 or 8, her mother died, and she became the head of the household. The woman who was responsible for the cooking, the cleaning, and all of that at about the age of 8. She grew up and had her own family, and her golden child was a little boy named David, who was Jay and Barrie's older brother. And David died very tragically in a skating accident when he was about 14 years old, and his mother never recovered. His mother took to her bed. Jay and Barrie was very young, and there was actually just a really good podcast on the Radio Lab that talked about how the stress of that impacted his life. He never really grew. He went through puberty, but it might have been kind of a stunted puberty. But the biggest thing that stuck out to me was he was so desperate for his mother's attention and her love that one day he dressed up in his dead brother's clothes and went into her room with his hands in his pockets, whistling the way his brother did.
Ooh.
And his mother said, "Is that you?" And he said, "No, it's only me." And it felt like for the rest of his life, he was really trying to win that affection, but he also had some issues because of that.
But it certainly sounds like it. Wow. That's
It's probably a little darker than.
that's a dark path. That's a really dark path.
So, I know, sorry. But for me, that made a lot of sense, because if you read Peter Pan, Peter Pan is, the character is very dark. He's almost like, if you've ever been around toddlers, he reminds me of a toddler, because he has all these huge emotions, but he can't control them.
Right.
So, a toddler is either like all love or all rage because they're being rewarded, and that's kind of how Peter Pan came across to me, and I think a lot of that came from Barrie as well.
So you also bring Hook into this.
I do think Hook was fun.
That and that was a little surprising. That he was the character I was rooting for. Which I mean, now yes, the original Peter Pan is there, but the Peter Pan that most of us know is the Disney Peter Pan. And I remember my daughter was Peter Pan for Halloween one year, and and you of course Captain Hook. You're afraid of him and the whole thing, but I was. I was kind of suspicious, because it's not very clear right away of which character it is, and then you're like, of course that's Captain Hook, and you leave it a little open in the end. Intentional?
Intentional.
Ah,
I always like
that's
the books.
great.
Like one of the things that really drew me to Peter Pan the book after I had that dream was I say it's like a charcoal sketch. It's not a full oil painting. So he's put the outlines of all these characters in there, but he's left so much room in the story for you to have your own thoughts and dreams and imaginations about it. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's such a popular book. I love a lot of books. I love the Lord of the Rings series, but the Lord of the Rings language has never made it into pop culture the way Peter Pan has. We don't say that someone is having a Mordor moment. We say they're a Peter Pan. We don't say that they're going off to, Mordor. We say they're going off to Neverland. And I just think that was so brilliant that we did it. So I kind of wanted to emulate that a little bit and let people have their own thoughts about what happens.
So did you have to get some sort of rights? How does that work with the the brand of Peter Pan?
So he left the rights of the play to Children's Hospital, so all of the royalties for it go there.
Okay.
But now, because it's kind of in the public domain, I was just.
So you can write whatever you want.
Then I kind of did.
That's great. Because I do think, I mean, like you said, there's a lot of room. So I at the end, I was like, okay, I think it was intentional, but I wanted to ask that question. But you could even go back, and do a prequel to, Holly Darling is the granddaughter of Wendy Darling. And that's, the story is focused mainly around Holly. But getting Holly to where she is in this book, there's a lot of, and you touch on that, obviously we get little glimpses of it. But you could even, now I'm telling you what to
Wouldn't
write.
that be fun?
So
That would be fun.
I'd like you to write a prequel, and then I'd like you to write something about books,
I was
so.
trying my best, thank you.
Could you please get on that?
Thank you. But yeah.
But it seems like there's all that possibility.
And that's what's so brilliant about J.M. Barrie. I mean, he has all these characters, and you know them. Like if I say
Right.
to you, "This is me," or I say to you, "Captain Hook," you picture who they are in your mind. But we don't really know like a ton about them for super well developed characters. And the other thing I love about Hook too is that in the stage tradition, the character of Captain Hook is also usually played by the same actor who does Mr. Darling. And I found that really fascinating because as an adult going back and reading Peter Pan, Captain Hook is kind of a good guy. I mean, he's the adult in the room. He's saying, "Knock it off, Lost Boys. Stop flying around. Get back to work." And he does play. The actors usually play the father role too. So it's kind of about seeing the joys of childhood from the other side.
What next for you now? Do you take a breath? Are you already writing something? Are you writing the prequel or the sequel?
Not yet. I'm actually working on a kind of a dark fairy tale, and I thought, because my agent isn't here, that if I was going to read something, I would read something from the new parts, because I figure you guys have all been so great, and this is my first in-person signing, and I thought it would be fun to do something different.
Please, that would be great.
Right.
Yeah. We're going darker.
We're going darker. Sorry. So, the story begins, as so many do, with an apple. In this case, to be precise, it starts with an apple orchard. One knobby and wild, tucked into a green garden of a valley between the roaring ocean and dark woods. Buffeted by wind, stung by salt air, the trees that grow here give the sweetest fruit in all of Maine, and those who have tasted them swear there are none that are equal anywhere else. On the first few days of the year, the orchid is open for picking. There's a strict limit on how many pounds may be taken. Still, people come from miles to wait in line, jostling for a spot in the early morning light. The lovesick whisper recipes to themselves for apple pie, for tarts and crumbles and turnovers. They imagine flaky crust, cinnamon and sugar, bites of delight that will bring their beloved to their side. Pregnant women in line rub the small of their backs. They shift their weight, imagining that first tart crunchy bite, and their mouths water. They'll cart as many home as they can, and in the dead of winter, when they crave light and warmth, and it feels as if they've been pregnant forever, I can't read anymore because I'm missing page 2. So,
Oh, no.
So that's all I got. But it's a retelling of a very traditional fairy tale that has a lot of really dark characters that kind of feed off of social media today.
Huh.
So you got a page, so I'm sorry. Oh no, here's the second page, I'm sorry. They steal to their freezer in the middle of the night where everyone else in their house is asleep. They'll reach into the back behind the frozen casseroles and hamburger patties, and their fingers will find the cold curve of the fruit they've secreted there. They'll eat it standing over the sink, not even waiting for it to thaw, and somehow it will still taste like sunlight, like tall golden grass and fresh air and turning leaves. The babies inside will kick giddily, and their mothers will startle, then laugh and return to bed to sleep better than they have in months. Everyone who tastes the meaning apples loves them. Everyone except Rose Minnie herself. It has been a long, long time since Rose has visited the apple orchard, and she wouldn't be here today if she hadn't been tricked into it. She lives in Florida now and buys her fruit at the grocery store, where apples are mealy things and citrus happily is what's for breakfast. Moodily, she kicks a windfall and watches it bounce down the hill. Almost simultaneously, an apple falls out of the tree and conks her on the head. So that's that.
So when you go dark, will you go, there's one particular dark scene in here that is, I even on like my shelf talker, I put just,
Right.
almost like a trigger, because,
Absolutely.
but will you go gory dark? Or, because there is that.
No, I'm not a gory person, especially since I've had kids. I don't like reading gore, I don't like watching gore. And that scene, actually, you can thank, Bryn Greenwood.
Yeah.
She's somebody who read for me early on. She's a great writer. If you haven't read her books, she's fabulous. And she kept saying to me, you either need to go there or you need to take it out. But you can't keep pussyfooting around it.
Yeah,
Because
that
I was
makes
like, oh,
sense.
put a little bit of darkness here and maybe a little bit over here, and she was like, no, either put it all in or take it all out. So it's all in.
There's a middle-aged book by Adam Gidwick. I can't think of what it's called right now, but it's based on the Grimm fairy tales, and it is really, really dark. And there's certain, like 8 to 12-year-olds that they just absorb it, and they love it. And of course, there's a lot of adults that like that. But I wonder, that was gore.
Right.
It was just, you're reading about the bloody mess and whatever, which I like dark. I read a lot of dark and despairing books. It's like, I might want to read something happy now. But so that's why I wondered, like, if you, where to the darkness you take it.
I think a lot of the original fairy tales, if you read the original tales before they were Disneyfied,
Yeah.
and I love Disney fairy tales, but I'm not knocking Disney fairy tales, I love them, I still watch them even though my kids don't watch them with me anymore. They're really dark. Cinderella's stepsisters don't have happy endings, they have really gruesome endings. In Hansel and Gretel, one of the versions, it's not the stepmother who sends them out, it's the mother. The same with Snow White, it's not the stepmother who sends Snow White out because she's too beautiful, it's the mother who's competing with her. And I think that that's really something that is, it's something that really draws people, because if they weren't so compelling, we wouldn't still read them today, and we wouldn't still tell them to our children today.
Right. And a lot of different versions.
A lot of different
yeah.
versions.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know, because I have a warm place for stepmothers. So. Stepmothers are not bad people. So I do this thing
Yes.
called Behind the Pages,
Okay.
where I like to ask, it's almost like rapid fire questions. So if you answer the first thing that comes in, and you can elaborate or not, that's up to you. Of course, I didn't bring my glasses, so.
There's a ton behind.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You're right. Thank you. So, maybe if it is Peter Pan, aside from Peter Pan, what is your favorite fairy tale?
I would probably say my favorite fairy tale is Sleeping Beauty, the original, because I just think it's so beautiful. I think the original was French, and it just has just a very languorous, gorgeous feel to it. So that would be my favorite.
Okay. PC or Mac?
Oh, Mac.
Mac,
Yes.
all right.
the way. Sorry.
I almost put typewriter in there, but then I was like,
No,
well,
no.
does anybody use that anymore? Do you ever skip and read the end first on books?
All the time. Especially the suspenseful ones. I want to know how it ends.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
All right. How many skip and read the end first? Wow. Okay.
Do you skip and read the end?
I do not skip and read the end. In fact, there are times where I have to cover the next page and make sure that I read, so that I won't skip ahead to even the next page.
Don't you get really tense though? Because I get
Sometimes,
really tense. I
yeah.
have a hard time with that.
But I force myself.
Push yourself to it.
So-
I'll try and do that next time.
You don't like surprises, so you want to know how it's going to end. And what if you're not pleased with the ending though? Like, are you still going to read the book?
Yeah.
Okay. You are, wow. All right, a lot of. Well, maybe we should tell you guys about that. We could talk all about it. What's your favorite genre to read?
Magical realism and fairy tales. Neil Gaiman and Alice Hoffman to me are just like, I actually got to hear Neil Gaiman in Boston last week, and I could listen to him read a phone book, and I would be absolutely happy to pay for that privilege. So.
We're doing an event with him next week. Do we know? Next week.
Here?
Yeah, up at the Bushnell, right? Yeah, yeah. He did come here.
I saw him here.
Oh, were you here?
I was here. I've
That
seen
was-
him pretty much. If he's within a driving range, I usually try to.
He's
stop.
amazing.
He is amazing.
Yeah.
He is.
Can I tell a quick little story
Yes,
about him?
please.
So he had all kinds of people come for him. Neil Gaiman.
Neil Gaiman.
He signed for 4 hours, and he would sign any book that you had, and of the different books, he had a different color pen that he wanted to use and whatever. So at the very end of the night, he just said, "Get me a bucket of ice," and he plunged his hand into it. But my story is that there was this one person, because again, there are a lot of interesting people here. This one person came up, and she had a tattoo on her inner thigh, like this big, of his wife's face. And he was like, oh, she was like, "I gotta show you." She's hiking up her dress, and we're all like, "Where are we going with this?" But yeah, it was, yeah.
So
But
did he sign it?
he did not know. No, he wasn't going there. He was like, "All right, give me your book." But, and do you have a favorite of his?
So my favorite used to be the Graveyard book, which I actually, one of the best things about, I own everything Neil Gaiman has ever written, I own in multiple formats. But my favorite are his audiobooks because he reads so beautifully. So we come, as you all know, we come from Massachusetts to Connecticut every summer, and we listened to audiobooks when my kids were little all the time. And we would put that one on, and I was a bad mom because it starts very violently. So my kids were listening to that in like third grade. But it's beautiful, and it became a tradition. And then when they were probably freshman and sophomore in high school, I realized that the book is not really, it's a young adult book. It's not really about a little boy in the graveyard who makes all these wonderful friends. It's really a metaphor for children growing up. And it just broke me. So I cry all the time, and my daughter will occasionally play that just to get, see, I'm wandering up now, just talking about it. So my second favorite of his, which is one of my stress relievers, is The Ocean at the End of the World.
Yes.
I love that. I listen to
That's
that
a
all the
beautiful
time
book.
too. So he's amazing.
Yeah, he's amazing. Okay, coffee or tea?
Tea. That's not tea. Lots of tea.
All right, any kind?
Jasmine Pearl Dragon is my morning tea.
Okay.
And then I usually have a bunch of tea in the afternoon that I don't admit to, so we won't mention that. And then I usually have herbal tea at night.
Okay, all right. And then lastly, pancakes or waffles?
Oh. I don't know. Maybe crepes.
Okay,
Not
sure. You do whatever you want.
All right, sounds good.
All right, well, would you like to take some questions?
Sure, I'd love to take some questions, not from you in the back. Anybody else?
Questions? Anybody have questions? Yes, Linda?
Hi, Liz and Lori. Thank you for being here.
Thank you guys for coming.
I know you worked pretty hard on this. What kind of research did you do while you were working on this book? And did you read the original Peter Pan
Yeah.
many times?
Many times, and I read the White Bird book as well. I read some stories online, mostly about his play. I read a couple of different biographies of Jay and Barrie. I read a lot of different websites about him. So just a lot of reading, mostly about Barrie's life, and then I watched all the Peter Pan movies that I could, and there's a ton of them. And my favorite one is the 2003 live action one, which is just gorgeous. It's really, really beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You said it took you a long time?
Yes.
How long?
So it probably took me around 5 years from start to finish. So it was a long process, and I went through a lot of rewrites. It was probably 4 years actually, and I wound up completely rewriting the last third of the book, probably twice. And actually, my daughter is mad that I don't give her enough credit for stuff in my book. So I have to say, I was really struggling with the end of my book, and I was driving with my daughter Emma, and I said to her, "What would you do?" And she said, "Oh, I do this, blah 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 blah." And I said, "I guess I will do that. That's a really good idea. Thank you." So,
Does she have an interest in writing?
she's a really good writer,
Yeah.
but she's not writing right now.
Okay.
Because she's in college.
Yeah.
So, but I hope she does. Because she's very good.
Great. Could be in the family.
She's really good.
So do you try to influence your kids' reading or writing style?
That ship has completely sailed, but I did have them trapped in the car for probably 15 years, so yes, I definitely did. And they're both really good readers. I mean, my only regret is that in high school they kind of lost track of that because they have so much work. But I see my daughter coming around to really get in college, and I'm really hoping that my son gets the opportunity to do that as well. But yeah, they listen to a lot of magical realism and fairy tales and things like that. No horror.
Would you ever co-write with either of them?
I would love to. I say that to my daughter all the time.
Yeah.
I would love to do that with her. I think it would be really fun. She's
Yeah.
really imaginative.
That could be really, really
since it took you 5 years to write it, when you were finished, did you start reading it from the beginning again to make sure everything worked out the way you wanted?
Yeah, and I actually, when I finish a draft that I think is pretty close, I actually use text to speech, which is a free software program that you put it in and it will read it out to you. So I did that a bunch of times too. And then I had, other people read it before I sent it. I had other people read it a lot before I sent it in again too. So.
If Darling Girl would become a major motion picture, who would you cast in the lead roles?
The only person I want, the only person I care about, everything else is negotiable, I will do it for free, is Andrew Scott for Peter Pan. I think Andrew Scott would be absolutely brilliant. And so it.
Who's Holly?
I just really just Andrew Scott. That's just as far as I've gotten. So.
Who's Andrew Scott?
Andrew Scott is Moriarty in the Sherlock shows, and he just was in he was just in something else. I think it was an Evelyn Waugh film. I can't remember, but I can't think of her name. But Love in a Cold Climate. He did Love in a Cold Climate too, and was brilliant in that. So he's charming, but also really chilling. So he's got, I see Peter as kind of being somebody who's super charming and really nice to you, and then you turn around and he's hanging you outside a window, just kind of for sport. And I think Andrew Scott would portray that really well. So.
Do you, were you relieved when you finished, or were you, some authors grieve that but your characters, you'll hopefully revisit them. So I don't know if grieving is the right word, but were you like, okay, it's done, or were you did you miss the process? Because when you spend that much time doing something, it becomes, really a way of life.
No, I think for me, first of all, I feel so lucky. I feel so lucky to be here with all of you. I feel so lucky to have a book out again, because it really is it's a really magical thing. But one thing for me, I think I've learned the last year is that I'm really happiest when I'm working. And having, that whole, my book, the story for me about Peter Pan is I gave this book to a friend of mine. I gave her the early manuscript. And I said, could you read this for me and tell me what you think, please? And she's a great writer, and she said, sure, what's it about? And I said, it's about Peter Pan. And she said, okay. And she went off, and she came back 3 weeks later and gave me my manuscript and I said, what do you think? And she said, well, I like it, but it's not about Peter Pan. And I said, what do you mean it's not about Peter Pan? And she said, Peter Pan doesn't show up until this far into the book, and, it's really not about him. You need to go home and figure out what you're writing about. And I was like, why did I ask you to read it? But I said very politely, thank you so much for your help, and went home and put it away and read it like 2 weeks later, and I was like, damn, she is right. It's really not about Peter Pan. It's about my kids growing up. It's about my daughter going off to college. It's about wanting to protect them forever and not being able to, and having to let go, and how physically hard and mentally hard that is. So I think for me, writing about that, especially during COVID, was really a sanity saver, because it gave me something to focus on that I could control. And now that my kids are, I'm essentially superfluous. Like, that's the job, right? When you raise kids, your goal is to put yourself out of work. So I'm essentially out of work. Pretty much. And I think that writing and being able to have something to focus on that's mine is something that's really important and really kind of saves you. So I guess I'm not grieving. I'm just kind of trying to move forward with something.
Penny, oh yeah.
What part of the day do you like to write? Morning, afternoon, evening, what day of the week, days of the week?
I have always worked my schedule around my kids until recently, because my son got his license. So now that schedule that I've had for 20 years is completely blown up. I'm like, I have all this time. Like, what am I doing? I like to write in the morning. I used to like to write at night the best. That's really my time to write, but it's not really conducive to life with my family. So I was switching to the morning, but during COVID, I lost my office. I had an office at home that I loved. And my husband was working from home and really needed a place with walls, because he talks to people. So then I was writing in the kitchen, and everybody would come down just when I had a great idea, and I'd be like, be quiet, and they're like, this is a public place, So now I'm writing in our garden shed. Pretty much, it's worse in the garage. It's the garden shed, because it's like that much further.
Can make it a she-shed.
My husband and son did it over,
Nice.
so all the stuff is out of it. It doesn't get Wi-Fi, which is probably a good thing, but it's really cold. So I don't like to write in the morning anymore. I'd like to have somebody go out who has my office, not naming names, and start the space heater for me. And then like an hour later, when it's, above 50 degrees, I can go out with my fingerless gloves and my hat and work. So mid-morning is probably the answer.
You work every day, like,
I try and work during the school year every day,
Yeah.
and then in the summertime it's kind of hit or miss. So hopefully it won't take me 5 more years.
Any desire to write an adult novel or a children's novel with your hand?
I would love to write a children's novel with Emma. I think that would be really fun. I don't think I could do it by myself because my brain doesn't necessarily go that way. But we have some ideas and we've talked about doing someday maybe. Yes, she says with trepidation.
Are you more productive with writing after you exercise?
No, because I use exercise as the carrot to get me to write. So I try to write first and then exercise. I probably mentally would be sharper, but I don't think I would do it after I worked out. I think I would just find something else to do. So I try and do that first.
great questions.
Thank you.
I find that I'm a lot more productive if I work out in the morning. So that's why I know you like to walk a lot.
I do.
Like, I don't know why I never walk as much as you do, but, so I figured, if you walk like 5 or 6 miles, we get all these great ideas and then we'll go home and just hammer them out.
Well, I do that at night. When I walk in the afternoon, 5 or 6 miles, I do get ideas. I mean, I do go home and write them down. I just don't write the ideas themselves. So, but thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
guys
I'm
so much.
excited for you all to read this. Really for doing this.